much for coming today. It's really a great turnout despite all the traffic problems. Really like to introduce Gary Khan from EOH today, and Justin Clark from EOH as well. Actually very good clients of ours as well. But Gary is going to be chatting about integrated GRC. I think it's a very novel and fresh approach to governance, risk and compliance. Gary has a huge amount of experience starting at university, a double major in human resource management and in risk and insurance management. Then moved on to PwC, where he headed up assignments for GRC assignments and risk advisory. Then CQS, where CQS took on the SAP GRC suite, and so Gary's worked extensively with all the service providers and in terms of GRC software, also with, as I mentioned, SAP GRC. And then EOH, I think, took over, or my understanding is took over the SAP GRC from CQS. So Justin and Gary and the team now head up risk advisory services at EOH, and we're working closely with EOH. So we really look forward to your presentation, and thank you very much, both of you guys, for being on site today. Thank you. I hope everyone enjoys it. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Appreciate the introduction. So, as Jonathan mentioned, we at BarnOwl partner, and especially around the GRC space. I see we have a full room, so I'm hoping everybody in the back can hear me. So, as mentioned, we're talking around the integrated governance and compliance process and how that all fits together. But before I get into that, I'd just like to maybe talk about the fundamentals of GRC. We're all GRC stakeholders and practitioners around the room, but really what are the fundamentals of that before we really talk around the frameworks and the integrated process around the processes, people and technology. So everyone been following the news lately? A lot of change happening in the world. Obviously, you have a new president, so the amount of change is staggering. And I think things are going to get worse before they get better. If you heard the budget speech yesterday, obviously VAT moving from 14 to 15%, the fuel levy hike. So I think things are definitely going to get worse before they get better. But in the long run, I think we're going to be better off as a country and as a global community. So coming back into integrated risk GRC, I'd just like to do a quick introduction. I think everybody's seen this picture before. These are the building blocks of any business, any substantial sized business. So you obviously start with a vision. That's the aspirational state that we like to be in as a business in 10 to 15 years from now. Then moving into the mission statement. So the mission statement obviously is our purpose. Is why are we in business? And very importantly, what I'd like to touch on is the strategic objectives. Now that's what GRC underpins, and in my belief, that's where GRC adds value on the strategic objectives of a business. So how do we ensure that as businesses and as an organisation that we achieve these strategic objectives reliably, taking risk into consideration? Now that's actually the definition, the OSEC definition of GRC. So first we start with the strategic objective, and depending what business you're in, you'll obviously have specific strategic objectives. So if you're in obviously mining or public sector or telecommunications, you'll have strategic objectives that's specific to you as a business. And what you do with strategic objectives, you link processes, because you're in that business, there's specific processes that are specific to you. And because you do that process, I'll give you an example. You want to create cloud as a platform. That's a strategic objective. That's one of our strategic objectives, by the way. And because you want to create cloud as a platform, as a strategic objective, the process that's applicable to that is software as a service. Because we have software as a service, there are specific risks that are linked to that process. So a lot of people are now link risks directly to strategic objectives. But if you had to map out the process in theory, you want to also have the process in there before you link the risk to strategic objectives. Because you have a risk, you should have a control in place to ensure that you're managing that risk. On the upside, you obviously have an opportunity, and because you have an opportunity, you have an enhancement plan. Now, this is where we as GRC practitioners play a massive role. So this is where the auditing fraternity, the compliance fraternity, risk management fraternity come into play to ensure that we achieve our strategic objectives. So how do we ensure that those strategic objectives, together the risk and controls, get managed appropriately? We need some sort of framework. So it's not just the technology. I love technology, but you need the processes and people to be in place before we can actually achieve those things. And how do we ensure that there is an integration between people, process, and technology? In order to do that, I'm going to hand over to Gary, who's going to talk around the integrated GRC platform.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Geez, good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
Morning,
Wow,
morning.
that's a knock to my self-esteem. Whenever I do talks like this, no matter where it is, Middle East, if it's in Pretoria, if it's in Johannesburg in Africa, someone always comes up to me and says, "You know who you look like?" Trevor Noah. I heard it in the audience. So that's not a bad thing to be, it's not a bad thing to look like Trevor Noah. It works wonders with the ladies if you're hitting on them. But the problem is, a few months ago, people stopped saying I looked like Trevor Noah. So I went to a friend of mine and said, people say you look like Trevor Noah. That's what people are saying to me. So why did they stop? And he looked at me and he said, it's basically because you got fat. Huh. So I'm the fat Trevor Noah here to talk about GRC. Ladies and gentlemen, do you know what this is? Rubik's Cube. When I was doing risk in university, I hated my lecturer because what he would do is he'd say, I'm going to take someone from the audience and I'm going to do that today again. No, I'm not going to. I saw some nervous looks there. All right. This is a Rubik's Cube. You need to solve the Rubik's Cube to make sure it looks like this, right? This is what you want to do, the ideal state. Everything's aligned and organized and sorted. This is a bit of a mess. All right. How many of you have GRC practices and initiatives that look like this? Whoa, well done. Please come up and tell us how you did it. How many of you have practices that look like this? Right? I think this is more accurate. Our government looks like this as well at the moment. So the goal is we want to get from here to here. And what we want to talk about is how do we do that, right? Before I get into integrated GRC, let's just recap the fundamentals. Let's look at the pillars of GRC. Justin just spoke about the strategic objectives and why they're so important for us, right? Absolutely. We want to add value to our stakeholders, to the business. Our employees want increases. I'm sure one of us wants that. The clients that we service want to get valued products and services. We want to achieve those strategic objectives. But GRC as we know it has not been based on adding value really. I'm talking very controversially. GRC has traditionally been based on regulations. All we wanted to do was comply. And sitting on top of that compliance were several pillars. We put policies in place, lovely GRC policies, well worded. We put in GRC processes, well defined. We paid consultants a lot of money to help us build those processes. And then we put people in place. We have a governing body. We have subcommittees of that governing body. We have chief risk officers and chief audit executives that drive these processes and policies. And altogether, that forms your GRC framework as we know it, a framework that underpins all of those items. On the other side, a lot of us have technologies that we've put in place that enable that framework to work. And what we do as well is have the implementation partners often supporting us in that technology. And again, we had a lot of consultants coming and being our advisory partners to assist. And all of that together forms our GRC solutions. So fundamentally, GRC has been based on two important parts, our frameworks and our solutions. That is the GRC pillars. Now let's take a look at that. Interestingly enough, would you be shocked to know that majority of these pillars still today operate in silos. That's a scary thing. When I came out of university, the theory said it should interconnect, it should do this and that, and I sat in my first board meeting with the clients, and yes, one of the board members said, is it bring a child to work day? Because I wasn't supposed to be there. But there I was sitting, and I had the risk committee come in and present the top 10 risks of an organization. I thought, oh, this is very nice. And the board said, great, we can make decisions on this. And then another committee came in, that was the audit committee, and they presented the top 10 risks of that organization as well. Do you think they presented the same top 10 risks? No. And the board called both parties back in, and the chairman of the board said, I'm sorry guys, were you two not talking? Were these teams not talking? How is it that you presented two different presentations of the top 10 risks of my business? Which priority should I take? And none of them could decide, and they got into a debate. Well, after they were reprimanded badly, the chairman turned to me and said, I apologize for this. This is not how these things generally go. And I was shocked, because that's not what the textbook said. But this is what's happening in our organizations today. I'm going to tell you a story. A man goes into the hospital, he's feeling ill. He gets in there and he goes and sees the nurse and says, I have a headache. So she sends him to the head doctor. The head doctor diagnosed him, said, fine, fair enough, I found what the problem is. They give him a prescription and send him home, and off he goes. He starts to feel better, but a week later, he starts getting heart palpitations, so he goes back to the hospital. And the nurse says, okay, you need to see a heart doctor. He goes to see the heart doctor, and the heart doctor says, okay, I see what the problem is. Here's a prescription, off you go. Goes home, takes the medicines, feels better. A week later, the guy comes back again, and this time, he has a foot problem, a sharp pain in his right foot. So they send him to the foot doctor. The foot doctor says, yeah, we know what the problem is. They sign off and say, here you go, medication, off the guy goes. He takes the medication and feels better for a month. A week after that, the man's dead. The family comes and they sue the hospital for a lot of money. So the hospital loses that battle, has to pay the family, and the board of directors of that hospital launches an investigation. They launched the investigation and find that the policies were a little lax, there weren't technologies to support a lot of these items, and they do a full-scale revamp of the frameworks and the technology or solutions. So what happens is each department, head, foot, and head, all get a new policy, robust, coming from service providers that have aligned them. They put in new processes and all of that kind of items. And then they'd redo a framework that talks to how they should look at doing head medicine, heart medicine, or feet medicine. And fantastic. Then they also find that they need to implement new technologies. So each division gets millions worth of new technology in, and the service providers enter into contracts to allow them to do those items. Do you think anything improved? A week later, another person walked into the same hospital and died of the exact same symptoms. Another autopsy was done, and both autopsies revealed that it was a common curable virus. What happened there? A fundamental failure from individuals who work in the same company within the same diagnostics teams not talking to one another. So what is integrated governance, risk, and compliance? It's a fundamental change in the way we approach GRC to try and get the traditional silos for the first time to talk to one another in a way that makes sense. And I say that there are three dimensions of integrated risk and compliance that we're going to take you through. We've got horizontal integration, which typically speaks to your cross-functional integration. You've got vertical integration, which typically speaks to your aggregation model. And this is the one that's really needed in our industry, is the dimensional integration, which speaks to culture. So let's take a look at that. What is horizontal integration? When we say cross-functional integration, it relates to the story I just told you. There are separate divisions that need to be talking to one another. You know the typical traditional silos that we have. We have compliance, and they need to look at all the regulatory stuff that we need to look at. We have assurance, which is your internal and external audit. You have your risk and fraud and IT security and your governance structures. All the traditional silos operating in their own standalone areas. And the board wants to see reports from all of them. And now we know there's a catchphrase, combined assurance or integrated assurance. That's all to give the board reliance that the strategic objectives will be obtained. Why did something like that come out? Because there were different pictures coming out to the board, and they couldn't make decisions intelligently. So isn't it basic common sense that these divisions should be talking to one another? At some clients, they're starting to get it right. What they've done is they've either had an overarching portfolio that embeds all of these with different SMEs and managers to drive each one of these departments, or where possible, you have separate silos with an overarching functional line that allows for them to report into that function. So someone is coordinating the activities. What does that look like for your framework? There should be rules for how each one of these divisions are talking to one another. On the other side, on your technology, you should have something that allows you to link your risk management to your assurance, to your compliance, etc. And that looks like a risk being linked to a control, being linked to an opportunity, being linked to your regulations, your policies, your fraud investigations, or your incident investigations. Tying a golden thread throughout your organization horizontally. When I talk about vertical integration, what do I mean? Everyone has heard about aggregation, but when you actually go and ask different practitioners in the market what aggregation means, everyone has a different idea. Essentially, we want to build a framework for allowing information to be fed out from the bottom of the organization up to the upper layers so that they can make intelligent decisions, and a method for them to disseminate information from the top of the organization down into it so that there's a feedback loop. Now, how do we do this practically? We've all heard about risk appetite and tolerance, and it's a very interesting, people will say it's simple, and it is, but there's also a lot of people who make it very complex. Risk appetite and tolerance. You want measures, thresholds, both financial and non-financial, that allow you to feed information up in the organization at the right levels. If you have an operational risk and it's high at that level, you want that level to keep it high because for them it is a major issue. But it's your thresholds that make sure you identify what's material for the board to see. So you want that model to feed the information up. Now, what about missing information, right? So if we do that, typically a lot of companies are doing that already. How do we make sure the board is still seeing and identifying the things that could blindside them? Well, that's where you have your underlying risks. You have strategic risks linked to various operational risks. And for me, an interesting thing is if you have a bunch of operational risks and each one is red, and you see the board's report and it's green, you know that there's a fundamental problem in that company because the leadership don't know what's happening in their business. And oftentimes you find that this type of information is getting to a lot of the boards. They're making decisions, and we've seen it with companies in the last few years, based on that green mark over there. This is a good investment, let's do it. But everywhere along in the organization, people have been warning them, but because people are afraid of the board and our leadership structures, the right information isn't getting there. So I'd like to argue that our companies globally are actually in a lot worse position than they think they are. So how do we align those kinds of things? Something else we can do, I did an audit of one of my clients recently, and I was shocked to find 8 different definitions of risk management in the organization. That's like us speaking different languages and trying to solve the same puzzle in the room. We're not going to get anywhere, right? We need to be talking the same language. It's very basic. Libraries. You won't believe how many organizations miss things filtering to the top because the risks were called something different along the way, but they're related to the same concept. So because something was ubiquitous between all our different divisions, and we called it something different, it appeared as different risks, so it fell off the radar and didn't reach the board where it needed to be. We fundamentally failed to align and tie those things back. We need standardized libraries for risks, controls, opportunities, so the information we do feed up is correct. So what does that look like from a framework perspective? Your framework should have a non-financial and financial model for feeding information up. Your framework should have standardized risk elements, libraries for each of those, your controls, your risks, your opportunities, that each of the different traditional silos can use because they're now all speaking the same language. And you should essentially have terminology and definitions. Now, a lot of companies have terminology and definitions in their frameworks, right? You say, well, why are you telling me something I already know, Gary? Go through your organization and see how many different divisions actually follow the same framework definitions. What people do is they see the framework and say, this definition doesn't work for me. So when the bosses come around, we'll say risk means this, but for now, we're going to say risk means this. You need to be driving those items in the organization, and your framework needs to be scalable so that any level of the organization can use it. Otherwise, you're missing the point. If a framework's too complicated to use, too far-fetched to understand, and doesn't scale for the different levels of the organization, no one's going to use it. So we need those rules for how information feeds up and how information feeds down. What does that look like in a system? In a system, you want a system that can build tolerances into it. You want a system that you allow to have different levels of risks and different dimensions. You want a system that allows you to link operational risks to strategic risks with a model for rating those operational risks at their correct appetites and a model for measuring the strategic risks at their correct appetites. Dimensional integration. Fancy word. What we're talking about is risk culture. The new COSO framework talks about this and goes into a lot of detail. But I have a bit of a grudge with a lot of best practices. They're fantastic to start off with. ISO 31 is fantastic start. The ISO guide that came out in 2011 on how to apply the initial principles, fantastic. The new COSO framework, fantastic. They're not prescriptive, they're guidelines, so they tell you what you need to do. But then they stop there. And then where do you get the information that you need? How do we actually coordinate these activities? How do I actually build an integration model? How do I actually aggregate information up in my organization? The new COSO framework says embed risk management into the DNA of your organization. And that's what I'm saying we should do here as well. But there's no guidance on how to do that. What do I actually do? Well, I'll give you some examples, and these need to be tied into your framework, approved by the board, and then fundamentally change your organization. First and foremost, we need to change the job descriptions of the board and upper level management teams. Their job descriptions should incorporate the fundamentals of GRC into them, because I'd argue that a lot of the people sitting on our board and executives shouldn't necessarily be there. They are there and they are leadership structures, so we need to work with them. But their jobs need to change. The world has changed and that position stayed the same, those positions. What else do we need to do? Well, if it's not incentivized for the board to actually guard the integrity of the organization, which it is implicitly in their fiduciary duties, but not to drive GRC initiatives, then it's never going to happen. We need to tie GRC KPIs into the organization. We need to ensure that there are measures that we can hold them to account for. For example, we all know the Wall Street guys. What they do is they'll do a risky bet and it will destroy the market, but the juice is worth the squeeze. They budget for the fine and pay that off within 72 hours, but have made billions on top of that. The CEO gets his performance bonus because he's generated fantastic value for his shareholders. But what if I told you that he should receive zero of that bonus unless he's ensured that he's conducted risk assessments throughout the organization? If not one risk assessment was conducted, zero amount of that bonus is paid out. You will see that fundamental change happen very quickly in the organization. Risk management will start to be driven because essentially it's driven from a tone at the top. If we can't change the minds of the guys leading our organizations, then the majority of the stuff we're saying here today and have been saying for a while are not going to happen. So this is such a fundamental change that we need to look at. The other side, a lot of boards want to look at generating that value, so they do want to make money. While then we should be focusing opportunities, because even if you look at the definition of GRC, it's governance, risk, and compliance. Where's opportunity in that? Have we fundamentally structured the definition and the name of the title and the industry incorrectly? We're always looking at it from a reactive process. What about being proactive? What about looking for opportunities, starting with that, rather than starting with your risks? Fundamentally changing the way we need to orientate ourselves. It's very difficult to do, yes, but it's these things that we need to be talking about. So what does this look like in a system? You need a system that allows you to identify key risk indicators that can be tied to your key performance indicators, that can be linked to an accountable person, that's linked to a strategic objective. So now I can trace the accountability and the responsibility in the system with the report that comes out of that. I need the ability to identify opportunities, and a lot of systems do that. But I need those opportunities to be tied to strategic objectives, to be linked to risks that they might lead to be linked to the other elements. And we need accountability against those opportunities. And the opportunities need to be on the same prevalence as our risk management, our opportunity management. We start doing these type of things, we'll fundamentally see a change in our industry. So to come back to the picture that I first spoke about, let's recap. We have the integration model, which talks about horizontal cross-functional, and we understood what we need to do from that perspective. We have our vertical aggregation model, which will fundamentally change the way we feed information up the organization. And we have our cultural dimension. I've mentioned a few of the items there that can fundamentally change the way we look at business. But it would make such a great impact already because it's totally different and starting from a different starting point. And that model sits on top of our traditional GRC building blocks. We have our regulations, we have our policies, process, people, which form our framework. We have our technology and our support and our advisory partners, which form our solutions. But if you add that to the integration model, you go from GRC to integrated GRC. So what does that do in summary? It's a fundamental philosophy. If you remember nothing else, just remember the guy with the Rubik's Cube up in front of the day. We want to take our businesses from here to here. We've been doing GRC. This is what GRC looks like. My brothers are marveloso with this stuff. You can solve it in 30 seconds. I'll probably solve it in a year or two. I didn't do anything, but I've just been doing GRC, the same thing over and over. No result. We need to figure out how we get from here to here, and we need to change it up. These blocks, the building blocks that make up the fabric of our organization, the fabric of our GRC practices and initiatives, need to talk to one another, and what you might eventually get after hard and painstaking work is an integrated GRC environment. Thank you. So just to speak about, before I get into the questions, the future is coming, ladies and gentlemen, just in case you didn't know. The future of risk management, if you look at a lot of the articles, which we call eGRC for nice reference, the digital GRC, we're talking about bot automation conducting risk assessments. We're talking about artificial risk assessments. We're talking crazy stuff, quantum computing. What will our technology look like that assesses our risk and our compliance, etc.? Now, can you imagine using our current frameworks for that type of model? We'll be in trouble. The reason we're trying to fundamentally put into place an integrated GRC model is because we need to gear up and get ready for technology, because it's not going to stop. The future's not going to pause. We're getting older, ladies and gentlemen. Unfortunately, I had to come to that realization. We need to be building these things now, and it's a future-thinking, forward-thinking, fundamentally different way of looking at it. Because if we're not ready, those things are going to happen, and we're going to be hit with risks that we never anticipated. Look at social media. The companies and boards of 10 years ago didn't foresee that fake news could crash their businesses, and it's happened. So are we going to be in the same positions, or are we going to start changing the game? All right. Any questions?
This IGRC model, how do you embed it in the risk management framework with regards to assessment, identification, and your treatment of your risk? Will you be able to align it in each and every one of those processes, or do you do it globally within the whole framework?
So there's two types of IGRC frameworks, if you want to put it that way. If your business is small enough or centralized enough, you can have a single framework that incorporates all the different areas. Now, a lot of the businesses aren't that small to do that kind of thing. You have large businesses, multinationals. Some of our SOEs are huge, so you can't do that kind of model. So you'll have siloed or separate frameworks that drill into the detail with their assessment models. What IGRC is not saying that the silos are wrong, because often we have very strong silos. What IGRC is saying is we need to have rules for engagement of how that information feeds to one another. So you have an overarching umbrella framework that aligns those individual processes. So your risk assessment, you have your matrix, you have your fundamental framework, and you have a technology that allows that to work. How does that information feed into your audit programs? How does it feed into your compliance and regulation? What is the information that they require to feed back to the risk team? And those kind of rules are not there. And I would like to see, I've written comments to OSEC and ISO and COSO to try and put those guidelines for an integration framework together. That's what I'd like to see in the new stuff coming out.
How do you say, artificial intelligence programmer within audit.
Yes.
But what I find is some of the challenges that I have is because there's this three silos, compliance, risk, and audit.
Yes.
It's often a challenge to get information from either, because it's not mandated. Put it that way. You don't have a mandate to go into risk and do what you need to do. Yes, there's ways to overcome that. But you mentioned earlier there was a structural change that's geared for the future, and you mentioned the fact that there's an overarching pillar over that. And does that prove more successful? Because for me, that opens up the mandate to it and becomes an intentional task. So rather,
one of my clients has moved the chief risk officer position, which is 3 or 4 levels down, into the board, giving them the power and mandate to drive certain things and call the other board members into question. Because previously the position sat here, and when that person challenged the board, they were put into a lot of trouble. There was a target on their backs. Now, by moving that position up here, you have a fundamental change. That person was in the GRC industry and had moved between each of the different silos. So what that allowed them to do is build a model to pull those things together. And being at that level and being a trusted advisor in the board level allows them to write the rules, for example, how things should be coordinated. And because there's a central person overseeing those processes, where yes, you do have the individual departments, the information flow between them works quite well. Because you think about it as a team meeting, all the managers for the different silos sitting together saying, great, these are how the things are working out, this is what information I need, this is what's happening in my environment, I need to conduct this audit, how do we work and process through it. So it just fundamentally works a lot better, rather than having the silos sitting with separate parties so low in the organization that there's really nothing much you can do about it.
Thank you, sir. I've got 2 quick questions. One, I heard you saying since the times are changing, we need to perhaps change the job descriptions of the board of directors. Aren't you not running the risk of operationalizing them, their work that they are doing? Because I think it's clearly defined in the Companies Act and the King 4 and many other pieces. Are we not running the risk of operationalizing them in such a way that we have too many layers of management of the processes? The second one is, I don't know how to put it. What risk are we exposed to when we have people who are extensively trained in auditing who are running risk management processes?
Yes, we've got the minimum requirements from certain legislation in terms of what board members need to look at, and we've got King 4 that sits on top of that. That's not in the regulation itself, but then adds as best practice to what they should be looking at. So if you actually go through King 4 is trying to talk about the stuff that I'm trying to talk about. It's the exact same thing. They're trying to fundamentally insert extra skills that the board should have, because currently what you find is a lot of the guys come out of the operations. Let's say it's an oil company. They would have been rotating amongst boards in different oil companies, but they would have never been really exposed to the various GRC silos, if you want to put it that way. They've been trained on it. They have some exposure. But the guys, for example, solve to that is by having people in the board who can advise that board at their level, not at levels where it's removed from the process. That there you having that change in the board composition and structures, people with the knowledge to act on certain decisions. You're finding that's not happening in the boards at the moment. I hope that answers your first question. The second question, so I mentioned it now, you do have very strong silos. I understand that. So there's certain areas that are well demarcated because there's stuff that audit does that risk doesn't look at. We don't want risk to intersect with those. We don't want risk managers conducting audits or legal experts conducting risk assessments, for example. They have their solid silos and compartments where they do certain work. What we are asking for is a way for them to feed information between the two, giving a clear line of where my stuff starts and where your stuff starts and what you need from me. So we talk about risk-based audits. Who's conducting the risk assessment? The risk experts or the audit team? And that's the different change. If the risk team conducts the assessments and provides those risks and the structures to the audit team, they can then drive those processes forward. We will be writing a more detailed article going into the actual points. We wanted to really touch on the basics and just say that we are in a position where we are in trouble, but it's good to know that because now we can fundamentally change the way we look at our organizations. And the reason is not only just to do it for now, it's to be future forward, looking towards all the things that are coming. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Justin. Thank you very much, Gary, for today. I found it it's very refreshing, I've got to say. It is the kind of thing we've been trying to punt a lot. I mean, the software, or lots of software out there does this kind of stuff. But to get it implemented and get it set up properly is very frustrating from a software provider because it's not just about the software, it's very much about the process, the culture, and we're still finding out there that a lot of boards, a lot of companies are not taking risk management seriously. They're paying lip service to it. And I think you touched on a very good point. Until you've got KPIs against individuals right from the top right down to the bottom, until there are actual KPIs around responsibility for risk management, culture's not really going to change. People change when it hurts them a bit. So, but I think with all the scandals that we keep seeing, and if you look at our government structures and the way that's changed and social media, people are not going to accept companies that are badly run or where there's been skullduggery and corruption, and people are sick of it, and social media spreads like wildfire. And eventually I do see that to be a responsible board member, you're going to have to be very knowledgeable about your business. Ignorance is not bliss, it's actually negligence. So, and KPIs, and the guys must be held to book. If you're sitting in senior positions and high up, you need to actually be accountable and responsible. It's not just about profitability. And of course profits come when you're running a business properly. So that's sort of the message, and I think that was very well articulated by Gary. And please stay and join us, and we're going to carry on chatting. And I see there's a question over there.
I just wanted to find out something. In South Africa, has this been implemented in any company?
So to answer your question, is the model implemented in South Africa? No, it's not happened at all. The problem is South Africa is still functioning on a very basic model. We still more, a lot of companies we go to are following tick box exercise, and that's what Jonathan was speaking to. The boards and the leadership haven't taken risk management and the GRC practices as seriously. The one that is taken very seriously that we all know about is audit. And audit has been a big focus, but to the detriment of the other areas. So what we are doing is we basically in our soapbox preaching about what needs to fundamentally change, and we've built a model to assist companies to do this. So we've done it in a few of our clients, predominantly in the mining and public sector, and we're seeing some results from having these kinds of changes roll out. That's what our advisory services is founded around. But yeah, there's a long road ahead for all of us in terms of that. A long road ahead.
Sorry, just a question. Do we have a sense of what the regulators
everyone we speak to, once, as yourselves in the room, GRC practitioners, once we speak to everyone and we connect the dots, it makes a lot of sense. So there's a lot of positive feedback from the governing bodies like ISO, etc., which is not at the regulatory level, but which they link back to. So there's positive uptake, but we're working with those bodies to try and get something out. As you know, the problem with a lot of the bodies is they have schedules for updates. So the last time ISO was updated was, can anyone guess? 2011. Yeah. Because the new coastal framework came out in 2016. It's now 2018. And things have shifted again. So, and legislation changes even slower than that. So, this is fundamentally, rather than sitting, as you see, regulation sits there. This is a model that can take you further, because the minimum to comply, this doesn't fit into that. This is trying to build something enhancing on top of it.
But I think to add to that, you've also got like the IRMSA, Institute of Risk Management, very actively talking to the Institute of Internal Audits, very actively talking to the Institute of Directors, very actively now more and more talking to the Institute of Compliance. So we've actually got quite a strong institutional culture that's building and getting stronger. And I think they're pulling things together. So I think the theory's there. It's how to get people to start embedding this kind of process in an organization. And I do think once you start getting KPIs right, I think that's something we really need to push for, right from the top, where people need to take this seriously. Then this stuff's going to happen. And if you talk to audits, I speak a lot to auditors, they're still doing control-based auditing, go run in focus areas. The concept of risk and control-based auditing, and it should be actually objective risk and control-based auditing, and it starts right from the top. What are your strategic objectives, your business objectives, your process objectives? How do they link up? And then where are the most important areas, where the risky areas are, and that's where the focus should be on audit. And it's not just about control auditing, it's about what are the controls, what risks are they managing, and how do those risks feed into the strategy and the objective. So there is, but of course that's the theory, and the practice is much harder. But I do think things are changing, and I think we've got to keep driving, and this is a great model. Excellent.
So may I just add to your question about the regulators? You work quite closely with regulators in the financial services industry, and I'd like to suggest that they are adopting a process and regulatory program of risk-based regulation and principle-based, outcome-based regulation versus the typical tick box. However, I'm concerned that those same regulators have not upskilled. So there's a lag, and when the analysts come and review a situation, they don't necessarily bring that knowledge. They are still in the tick box world. And so a lot of what you're doing is very subjective in motivating your reason for your approach to a risk. And if they disagree with you, you have, it's an awkward situation, because in the tick box world, they just go, yes, you did that, yes, you have the process, the policy, the people, you submitted the report, tick. But when it's more subjective, why I chose to treat a risk like this, it's very hard, because you're now into subjectivity, and I do believe there's a lag of the so they propose it, and I believe they embrace it, but I think the actual people doing the work there's a gap. They haven't caught up with that.
I think that's a very good point, especially what we see on the compliance side. Still very tick box driven. This is what the Act says, this is what all the provisions say, these are all the checklists. But why have you got that Act there? What's it for? What risks is it managing? You should rather start with what are the risks, and then which risks talk to which pieces of legislation, and then how are we going to make sure that those pieces of legislation, that we're meeting those regulatory requirements. And I think you are right, that's not there at the moment. That is very siloed still, compliance. But I do think that, if you look at all the ISO standards, the 14,000s, the 27001s, the NIST, all these standards are becoming risk-based. I think FASE FICA or FASE, they're all talking risk-based. So that makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, if someone came to me and you're trying to run a business and they start talking to me about low-level risks or detailed controls, like let's say I worry about cash flow. Cash flow is a risk I can get my mind around, but I don't understand all the details around debtors, creditors, VAT, this, that. But I've got departments that understand those details, but I just want to know what the results of those and how they feed up to my cash flow risk, and then also whether I'm in breach of any legislation based on not paying VAT or something like that. So that's really the fundamental, and if we can get the right messaging at the various levels of the organisation, right up to the top, they're going to take us seriously. But if you walk in there and, as you say, auditors are saying this, risk is saying this, compliance is saying that, the guy's going to say, listen, I've got a business to run. I haven't got time for all this conflicting information and all this legislation and all this tick box regulatory stuff. I'm trying to make a profit here. Please leave me alone. But if we get clever and integrate this and people can make decisions on what we're telling them, then we're actually going to really be adding huge value to our organizations.
I like the point that you've made on the change jobs, especially on the board side. And on our side, we did a qualification audit, probably it was more than a year ago. But we didn't do the board and the committee members and all that. And from what we did, there were a number of major findings that we've encountered, especially on the executive side. You know, also because like I'm on the monitoring and evaluation, and we're responsible for compliance. So how do I probably go up about to make that audit that we've never did, as for checking, you know, the qualification of the board, whether like do they really meet the requirements and so forth.
Fundamentally asking, how do we as an organization today challenge our leaders? That's what it is. So, you know, my boss is sitting in the room here, I also have to watch what I'm saying. So how do we do that? I like what I think it was Chris Palm said is, as a risk manager or as a GRC practitioner, one, you have to have a tough skin, and two, you have to be comfortable with the target on your back, unfortunately. Because as I said, fundamentally those positions are too low in the organization. So we've structured it incorrectly. Ideas for looking at that is we need, if you think about a listed company, it works a little bit better, where you have the shareholders which you can appeal to, because the board actually is responsible for ensuring their value. You have the broader stakeholders, which are, we mentioned, regulators, etc. Bodies like IRMSA, etc. If we start having these conversations, because what I find is, unfortunately, no one knows about this. No one knows that these things should be fundamentally in place. So if we try to start broaching a conversation with the board member today, hey, you know, your job description should change, we're going to have a bit of an issue, because it's not well documented, it's not out there, it's not known. We're not challenging those kinds of concepts. So we need to be, and I like the idea in American society to have lobby, where different groups and organizations come together and you lobby certain things, as Jonathan was saying. We're starting to get traction with IRMSA, with IIA, SA, with IRM, Institute of Risk Management internationally, with OSEG, who's reaching more and more countries. South Africa is still new in terms of the OSEG models and those kinds of things, but we need to be driving and having those conversations as the starting point. It's going to be a long road.
So I think just to add to that as well, there are two things. One, I think private sector is a bit easier because they have an audit committee and it reports to a board, and I think public sector is possibly where it's more complicated, because SEOs might have boards, but government departments and municipalities are basically the risk people, and the auditors are employed by the senior director generals and people like that. And then if you're going to now challenge the guys, then you're under threat of losing your job, kind of thing. So
becoming an enemy.
Becoming an enemy. I mean, that's the problem. So there's a fundamental, I think, structural problem in the public sector. I mean, I suppose you meant to report to the minister, but I mean, who's going to ever, or councillors, but I mean, everyone's got their own agendas there. So there's not enough independence. This is just my opinion. Private sector's a little bit different, but it's still, you still do need knowledgeable people, I think, at senior levels, and that don't see risk and auditors as the enemy either. Because I think if we start doing more around, we're trying to help run this business properly from opportunities, not just risks, because out of risks come opportunities as well. But I suppose where there's fraud and corruption and all that, you're going to run into trouble because you are threatening people's ability to pilfer. So, yeah.
We've spoken about King 4, and King 4 has a principle in King 4 that talks about board assessments. So the board assessment principle has to be done on every 2 years now. That's the new rule. And one of the things about King 4 is that you need to have an independent board assessment done. Part of the independent board assessment, you will ask the questions. So someone will come in and ask the question about what are the right skills, the composition. You know, you have that whole interview process with your board members, with the chairmen. You have that whole, you speak to each of the board members without individually, so you have an idea of what the board is doing. So that gives you a sort of comprehensive answer of how your board is looking in terms of their skills, their composition, what's the feeling around the table from your exec level, from your board level. So that's going to help you, because then you are not put in a position as an employee giving an assessment to your board on their composition. It's an independent view. And it also needs to be done as a peer review for the board. So there's two types. It's independent and non-independent, where the board also reviews themselves. So King 4 has now built this in very well, and you should just look at the practice and try bringing it into your company.
Perhaps one way to aid is focusing on the deliverables as opposed to someone's qualifications, because it can be a bit offensive, or it can even make your work difficult if you start off by saying what are the qualifications, or we are doing an audit on the qualifications of the board members. But if you look at the objectives of the organizations, scale them down to the deliverables that should be achieved, scale them down to the kind of challenges you are facing in the organization, and then say, let's speak about the solution. Perhaps we need this composition in terms of skills within these levels, not only the board, the various levels of the organization, including the board. It will be more understandable than to say we're doing a qualifications audit of the board members.
I think to summarize there, you're actually playing the ball and not the man.
Yes.
Don't go for the person, because everyone will get reactive. We all feel we have to defend ourselves. But if you start playing the ball and the right processes and what you're trying to achieve, that's a very good point. Yeah. Good. Thank you very much, everyone, for today, and we'll see you in the coffee room. Thanks.
Thank you.